in Philosophy of Right, which Hegel wrote in 1822 toward the end of his life, or 10 years left in his life, that's not to the end, hopefully. Uh, uh, in Philosophy of Right, he famously says in the preface, the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the falling of dusk, which means philosophy can't tell us what to do. That philosophy can't, it perceives what's happened, it can't predict the future. And so that basically says, I don't have a political project. I think that's true. I think that Hegel himself really didn't think my system can tell us what to do politically. But I do think it does provide some rough guidelines that I think he didn't himself fully think out. So one of those is, I think this idea of the necessity of not trying to escape contradiction. So can we discover a political program that makes sustaining some antagonism or contradiction its primary driving force? And that, I think, I don't know if that's what the clear contours of that politics are, but I think that would be something like Hegel's politics. So even though there is this, I wouldn't call it a quietist, but a strain in Hegel that I have nothing really to say to political actors, I think there's certain path that he can put us on that does have a political content to it in a way that he himself, I don't think was necessarily aware of. So I think one of the things that happens after Hegel is that his followers try to give his thought a political content, but in doing so, they reject this idea that contradiction is necessary in order to say, we got to treat contradiction as a problem that we can get beyond. And so that, what was known as left Hegelianism or the young Hegelians, that entire strain, I think, while it politicizes Hegel, it also bastardizes Hegel in a way that I think is really not only damaging but even dangerous. And so I feel like if there's going to be a Hegelian politics, it has to stay true to that central idea, which I think is hard. I think it's a hard way to understand politics, but I think that's what it has to be. So one of the main interpretations of Hegel's politics is that he's advancing this idea of mutual recognition. So that means I recognize you, you recognize me, I recognize Joe, Joe recognizes Jenny, etc. etc. So all, this mutual recognition creates a world in which everyone feels like they belong. So that's the idea of mutual recognition. It's kind of a world in which there's no one who's left outside. So a couple problems with that. First of all, it's interesting that Hegel does talk about mutual recognition at different points. So most famously in Phenomenology of Spirit, where he talks about the struggle between the master and the slave. And the struggle between the master and slave is, Hegel says, a struggle for recognition. And the problem is the recognition never works. So the master wants recognition from the slave, but the slave is unworthy, because the slave is a slave, of really recognizing the master. And so there's this, and this is why Alexander Kojève says mastery is an existential impasse, right? So there's no way that you can get what you're looking for from the position of mastery. Because, and so a lot of people have, and Kojève especially, have taken off from this idea and said, okay, so through the path of the slave, we can come to a point ultimately of mutual recognition where it's not someone dominating another, but it's all of us on a horizontal playing field recognizing each other, not hierarchically. Okay, so that seems nice, but the problem with that is, according to Hegel, that it's a way of, it's sort of another version of the idea of synthesis, another version of, so bad thesis, mastery, antithesis, servitude, synthesis, mutual recognition. Okay, well, that's not Hegel's thought. And so what I find interesting is the whole philosophy of mutual recognition, and there's a group of thinkers, most notably around in Pittsburgh, but there are a lot of others. Robert Pippin is probably the most famous of these, who believe that mutual recognition is the end point of Hegel's philosophy. But one thing that's true in all of Hegel's works is it's the end where he really gets to what his actual position is. And mutual recognition, when it comes up in, say, philosophy of right or in sort of in phenomenology in the margins, it never comes to the end. It never is at the end. So it's always a position that has to be, it's necessary, but it has to be surpassed. So he does think there is a point of mutual recognition, but that's completely insufficient precisely because it doesn't recognize the necessity of some antagonism between subjects that even makes them capable of interacting with each other. So mutual recognition for Hegel is ultimately misleading because it doesn't understand the way in which there's going to always be a fundamental alienation or a fundamental barrier in any kind of relationship, and that's what mutual recognition minimizes and doesn't fully get. So even to maintain mutual recognition, there has to be some antagonism actually blocking my direct relationship to the other. So that's the real problem with the idea of mutual recognition, that it fails to see its own very condition of possibility is what Hegel would see. And that's why his end point is always something like absolute idea, absolute knowing, absolute work of art, absolute state. That's not his term, but that's just my term. That's because in the absolute, you recognize the necessity of that blockage or hindrance or antagonism or contradiction, and you don't think I can just smooth it over with some mutuality or some synthetic operation in the way that the politics of mutual recognition does. I actually think this is a pretty popular political position today. Like, I'm going to advance my position, recognize me, I just want to be properly recognized. And I think that's a real danger that Hegel's philosophy of universality would be wanting to combat. Today, resistance has a good name. People like to be part of the resistance. They like to be, even if they're not part of the resistance, they want to be rebelling, they want to be negating the powers that be, they want to be opposed to power. And Hegel's view of that is not very sanguine. So Hegel, it's not that he's on the side of those in power, but he thinks if you remain just in this politics of resistance, you actually end up in a very, what Freud would ultimately call a hysterical position, in which you're attacking the powers that be, but in a way that depends upon their existence. So your constant complaints about, I'm not against all complaints about power, of course, but if you fall in love with the position of resistance and never want to become in power yourself, then your complaints end up enabling and that your position outside of power relies on someone else being in power playing the bad guy. And I think one of the essential nice points of Hegel's thought is he doesn't think you can let someone else play the bad guy. Like, you have to be your own bad guy. In other words, you have to be willing to take on power yourself and thus be responsible and be guilty and enact what your ideas are. That's why it's interesting that I like to think of the contrast between Hegel and Martin Heidegger. So they both got a very famous call to Berlin, like, come to Berlin and be the philosopher at the University of Berlin. And Heidegger said, no, I'm going to remain in the Black Forest where I can really think because I don't want to get too close to power. He had gotten too close to Hitler, but that's a whole other thing. He was already a Nazi, so that wasn't a problem for him. But Hegel accepted. So Hegel said, I'll go to the University of Berlin, I'll be at the center of the philosophical world, and and he was. So it's an interesting contrast, and I think their political position, I think a lot of us would say, wow, Heidegger's is the more authentic position. He wanted to stay close to home and stay on the outside of power. And Hegel sold out, he agreed to be part of the power structure, but Hegel's point is, you should sell out. You should, not in the sense of like try to make a lot of money on your brand, but in the sense of be willing to be part of the power structure so that you can actually enact what your ideas or what your politics is, rather than just holding back and complaining all the time. My favorite filmic example of this comes from, I think, what I think is the masterpiece of a certain genre, the genre of the teen film. So there's a great teen film called Heathers. And in Heathers, it's about the complete domination of a school by this, I guess you'd call it a popular clique of three girls. They're popular but totally despised, as all popular people are. And these three girls completely run the school, led by the main one. And through the course of the film, one of them dies, one of them becomes marginalized, and the third at the end is about to reassume power of the school after there was a whole catastrophe. The school was threatened to be blown up, but the being blown up is averted by this other member of the Heathers who's not named Heather, named Veronica, played by Winona Ryder. And so at the end of the film, Winona Ryder's always she wasn't sure what to do about the Heathers, and she decided, I'm going to leave. At one point she's like, I'm just going to get out of this whole popularity thing altogether. But then at the end of the film, there's an amazing scene where she comes up to the Heather that's now thinks she's in charge, and she takes the ribbon off her hair and she goes, there's a new sheriff in town. And she's all covered with smoke because she's helped to stop this explosion of the school. And she kisses her on the cheek and gets her cheek all sooty. And then she walks down the hall and befriends the most ostracized person in the school who has tried to kill herself because she's been made to feel so ostracized. Her name is Martha. I just remember her nickname in the film, Martha Dump Truck, because it's Martha Dunstock, but they call her Martha Dump Truck because she's overweight and she's uncool and no one likes her. And at the end of the film, Veronica institutes this new order where they're walking down the hall and Martha's in a wheelchair kind of going around her. It's almost like a love scene. And they plan to go out that night and or come over and watch a couple movies and pop some popcorn. And it's a fascinating moment at which she institutes a new order. She's not afraid of instituting a new order, but it's a radically different kind of order because all of a sudden those who are the oppressed no longer have to worry about not being included because it's an order in which he institutes it, but no one is included. So it's a fascinating reversal of the existing power structure, but in a way that doesn't refuse power, doesn't just say, oh, I don't want to be in power at all. She says there's a new sheriff in town, so she institutes this new power structure, but it's radically different. So I think, to me, that's the great Hegelian and the great moment of Hegelian politics in film. Marx famously announces a critique of Hegel in which he says, we're going to turn Hegel upside down and thus stop him from standing on his head, turn the dialectic right side up. And I think it's very easy to see the appeal of Marxism and Marxist materialism against Hegel's supposed idealism. But my position is we should think of it the other way. Even though Hegel came first, we should think, what's Hegel's critique of Marx? And my idea would be this, that for Hegel, as I say again and again and again, the point is reconciliation with contradiction. But I think for Marx, the point of political struggle is overcoming of contradiction. So he points out the contradictions of capital and then imagines the revolution of the proletariat introducing a communist society in which we have overcome economic contradictions, in which the contradiction between the mode of production and the relations of production, those are Marxist terms, no longer exists. So we've overcome the basic socioeconomic contradiction. And for Hegel, absolutely impossible. So there's a way in which maybe it's unfair to Marx to say Marx is to blame for Stalin, but I think once you have the idea of overcoming contradiction as a possibility or as a goal, then I think anything goes, right? Like if we really could create a society that overcomes contradiction, then why, how many people is too many people to die for that? 6 million, 13, maybe that's too many, but 1,000, maybe that's worth it. So, and I think what's nice about Hegel's thought is he disallows any kind of calculation of that genre, because once you calculate in that way, you're assuming that there is a their end point is the possibility of overcoming contradiction. But Hegel thinks philosophically he's shown that is not a possibility. That's not on the table. I think there's a nice joke that relates this. So about just the absolute impossibility of overcoming contradiction. So it's a joke about men and trains. So the joke is like this: how are men and trains similar? And the point that the answer is both stop before you can get off. So right. So what that nicely shows is the way in which there's this absolute disjunction in the sexual relationship that can't be overcome, because the stop before you get off, that's just part of the nature of things. And I think that's what Hegel is getting at in his political philosophy, and in what I would imagine his critique of Marx is, that Marx doesn't really fully accept the necessity of contradiction in the way that Hegel does, and that's what sends his politics awry, even though his analysis of capitalism is amazing, and it far, far surpasses. I mean, Hegel didn't really have any sense of what capitalism was in any serious way, and Marx does. So that's clearly, in terms of economic analysis, there's no comparison. But in terms of political project, I think there is a way in which Hegel belongs as the critic of Marx and as someone who comes after Marx rather than someone who comes before, who's surpassed by Marx. Okay. Okay.